Thank you for joining us, and I'm happy to have you here with us on the CAS weekly seminar that we are organizing every Thursday with different fellows who are covering the wide range of topics. And Sanja mentioned last week on Ceres that we spent, and by accident we spoke a little bit, Milica, about the topic you are going to cover through the article you are also familiar with, the article I wrote for Birn, and my intention was to get some insights and comments from my fellow colleagues in order to help me out in developing a research paper, actually, from what I did. However, in my paper I focused on diaspora, and I only scratched a little bit the topic of Yugonostalgia, and I only covered a tiny corner of this research area, in which Milica Popović is an expert. So I'm just, before giving the floor to Milica, I'll just say a couple of words about her. Milica is a PhD candidate at the interdisciplinary doctoral program in Balkan Studies at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Ljubljana. She is working with the Professor Mitja Velikonja, and at the Doctoral School of Sciences Po in Paris under the mentorship of Professor Jacques Rupnik. She's gonna give us some talk about the concept of Yugonostalgia and post-Yugoslav memory of narratives of the generation of last pioneers who were born in between 1974 and 1982 in the three post-Yugoslav countries: Slovenia, Croatia, and Serbia. The way Milica is approaching this field of study is concerned with looking at how Yugonostalgia is actually becoming politically relevant. Politically relevant for the people who were born between 74 and 82, and arguing actually that these people might be involved in the left-wing activities nowadays in the region. So, Milica, again, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Philip, for invitation, and thanks everyone for being here. It's really amazing, like Sanja said, to see so many familiar faces. I will be sharing screen, but host the disabled participant screen sharing. Is there a possibility to share my PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, I think it is.
No, it doesn't. I don't have I need the host to allow me.
It's okay. Lucia is doing that. Okay. Just a second.
Good. Yeah. As Philip said, I am at the very end. I'm just waiting for the corrections of Slovenian translations of the summaries of my thesis and doing the index, which is a new skill that I will have to learn. That's going to be fun. And submitting, hopefully, really like in the next couple of days. So this is also the phase where what I'm presenting is kind of a finalized PhD thesis, while every time I prepare for a presentation, I get into a state of panic that it's not good enough and it's not finished and there are so many things missing. So I'm actually really looking forward to hear your reflections, and so we can also continue kind of thinking what could be further developed from the thesis. Okay, super. So here we are. I hope everything is fine. You can see, so we can start. Where did the idea come from? When we say Yugonostalgia, it is usually a term that is very much connected to cultural studies, popular media, media discourses, or the negative kind of connotations of these transition losers. It's always connected to the older generations. But what is interesting from the political science point of view is that the notion of nostalgia started entering at all the field of research and interest, primarily in post-socialist countries. And you're all well aware of the notions of nostalgia or even post-Soviet nostalgia. And this is pretty much how Yugonostalgia also entered the focus of research. But on a wider scale, it was really for quite a long time reserved only for the post-socialist countries, which would itself kind of also had a certain element of representing the problematics of the development of the post-socialist countries, not being sufficiently capable of actually accepting the new developments of, on one side, the market economy, and on the other side, the so-called democratization processes. In the course of my research, what has been very interesting to know that in the media discourses, and then also kind of overspilling to some more analytical works, is that in some of the appearances of certain phenomena, like the Trump gain of the presidential elections in the United States or the Brexit vote, nostalgia started to be prominent. And the analysis of these phenomena have been linked to saying, once again, in a very negative manner, well, this is all happening because those people are nostalgic for the times when things were so much worse. And that's, I suppose, the idea where in July 2018, there was this wide European survey, which was trying to kind of, for the first time, and the only survey that I am really acquainted with, trying to connect the political space and nostalgia, especially within the European space. And once again, the results that have came out were mostly linked to the unemployed, the economically anxious, working class, and what have the results also claimed as that the nostalgic people are actually the right-wing people, and they are the ones who are mostly voting for populist leaders these days, who are engaging with fake news. So the political science kind of has this very imbued, so to say, space when we are discussing and thinking about the concept of nostalgia. So the idea for my thesis came, okay, I do believe that nostalgia is important for the political field, but I want to approach it from a completely different perspective. First of all, I want to look in a different generation. I don't want to look into the oldest generation. I want to look into the generation that is actually being politically active as we speak. And also in case of Yugonostalgia, a generation that has been least researched so far, because a lot of surveys, public opinion polls that we look are usually more keen in kind of, even if making these comparisons between the older generations and the new generations, the generations that were born after the dissolution of Yugoslavia. I found interest in this generation of the last pioneers, as Philip said, born between 74 and 98. Who have actually been born in Yugoslavia and then continued their political socialization and their journeys into adulthood through the dissolution and the wars, and today are politically active. So basically the two key variables of the population that I have researched is on one side belonging to the generation of the last pioneers, and on the other side being politically active, all throughout the political spectrum. So not only the left wing, but my interviews also came from the center and from the right wing. I will go into the sample a bit more in depth a moment later. I wanted to see, so on one side, what is their perception of the term of Yugonostalgia? How do they understand it? And secondly, how through their life memory narratives do they actually make space for this dialogue between their memories and the political notion of the memory on Yugoslavia and Yugonostalgia. So I spent about 2 years in the field in Slovenia, Croatia, and Serbia. I have 62 interviews that have been included. Those have been in-depth interviews, some lasting up to 5 hours. And interestingly enough, I actually had 65 interviews that I have conducted. There was a number of misunderstandings regarding the age criteria. A couple of people from right wing, especially in Slovenia, have not really been politically active. So it was interesting also to see that they wanted to participate. And very often this is an occurrence that I have encountered, that they actually really wanted to discuss this whole story and tell their story. Maybe the most interesting anecdote is that I had an interviewee from Serbia who participated in the interview, and for whom later on I discovered that he does not belong to the generation of the last pioneers. He is younger, but he has played throughout the interview that he was indeed born in 1982. And this is probably something even more interesting to see. Why would anybody actually stage himself as the last pioneer, even if not being one? So what is a sample? As I said, two key variables were belonging to the generation and being politically active. The rest of the variables were not controlled. So they were also in a way showing some sort of an atmosphere, a depiction of the political space today. Of course, the gender disparity is the one that is reflecting the political participation all throughout the countries. What was interesting to see that 90% of the participants do have tertiary education. And this is also a reflection that opens the question of the participation of lower educated classes in the political space today. Regarding the ethno-national self-identification was already some sort of an introduction into the interview itself. There was only one participant from Croatia that immediately said, yes, I am Yugoslav. And then there was a number of these ambiguities and ambivalences that started appearing, because people would say, well, you know, I am a Croat, but I don't actually feel like, so there was this immediate need to kind of justify almost their choice. And then also to always make an additional note, but you know, I'm thinking to actually declare as a Yugoslav in the future. And this is the kind of reflexivity of the interviewees that has been encountered throughout the interviews. The process of interviews has been extremely self-reflexive for myself, but also for the interviewees themselves, as they would change their opinions throughout the course of the interview, change some of the things they have already said, start thinking. So very often they would say, I never thought about this before. So actually, yeah, I have a different opinion. So there was this kind of also of a sentiment of a need to tell their story. I was trying to have a number of people who were members of parliament in the time of the field work, political party members, people who are involved in different parties, initiatives and movements, NGOs, trade unions, etc. Regarding the political identification, I have decided to leave it to the interviewees to self-identify. And this has been the result. 60% have self-identified as left-wing and only 15% as right-wing, and then the small percentage in between. If this would have been done from a different angle of more theoretically based analysis, personally, I would definitely not all of the 60% identify as left-wing. But this is another point of view, of course, which is also a possible road of reflection and research further. But it also shows that there is a lot of ambiguities about the notion of left-wing in the post-Yugoslav space. And this has been very, very clear. What has been an important element to see, mostly even from the very beginning, is that indeed in a lot of these reflections and trying to show the convergencies between the answers and the narratives that have been presented, is that almost always generational positionality comes before the political positionality. So the elements of the sentiment of a common generation influenced more the memory narratives and the perceptions than the right-wing or left-wing or center positionality, which kind of concludes that there is this sentiment of a common generation. A most common adjective that they use is a lost generation. And what was also interesting to see, there was this extreme sentiment of helplessness. I was interviewing political actors. As you could have seen, those were 50% people who are actually participating in political parties that are leading or in government in those three countries. All of the interviewees had this very strong distance towards the political field. They would be speaking in third person. They would be always saying they, them, we need a change, even if they themselves actually participate in the space. And I do think this is another generational kind of delineation. Once again, it is important to say that since the end of the fieldwork, which was a year and a half ago, till today, even some of the very concrete interviewees have been starting to take up more and more prominent and important positions within their political parties, within their movements. Some of them changed their movements into political parties. So I would believe that probably if we did some sort of longitudinal kind of research, we would see that this sense of helplessness might change as the generation of the last pioneers enters the political field more prominently. And then, of course, I believe to the group here, I don't have to explain who the pioneers were, but this is just always a question that does come up in other presentations. So I will just save our time and keep us the time for discussion later on. This is a diagram which tries to kind of explain how these memory narratives have played out all together. Starting from the very youth, the growing up of the last pioneers, going into this period of the rupture, the dissolution, the wars, into the present, because as we know, memory is always defined by the present, and it is always a memory in a specific point of time. So also important to keep in mind in my perspective is to understand that these memories are actually really the memories that they have been presented in the time of the interviewees. Memories are always changeable and they might not be the same tomorrow, or they might not have been the same yesterday. What has been a unifying code which has emerged is the negative present. There was not one single interviewee that actually had a positive relation towards the present in which they are living, in which they are being politically active. And through this narrative, we have come to the discussion about Yugoslavism, about Yugonostalgia, and what does it actually mean in the political space today. Basically, the diagram is trying to show two key things of memory narratives. One is, of course, the continuity and the need of continuity, because in a way we are construing our identities. It is exactly through this continuity of our life narratives. The other one is, of course, the circularity. We are always and continuously changing the narratives as the changing of our positionality in the present time, in political sense, in the overall contextual space happens. Discussing the childhood of the last pioneers, maybe the most important conclusion was that family was always the most important element. The family socialization was stronger over the school and wider environment socialization, and also, as you will see later on, it was also stronger than even the concrete war experience. So it really had a primary role in construing the identities and the narratives and the understandings. The right-wing interviewees have shown almost in all cases that their political positionality comes from a paternal heritage. It was always referred to fathers who were right-wing, never mothers. And it was most often when trying to explain how did they become activists, why did they become activists, it was, well, my father was, and I wanted to continue the heritage. So this was interesting just to note. Largely among the interviewees reminiscing about their childhoods, they do not remember any kind of ethno-national identity crisis or disputes until the very beginning of the war. trying to discuss what are their values when they think about what it meant for them to become pioneers. Most often it was said, well, you know, this is actually the value framework that I still try to respect and abide by today. And this was regardless of their political positionality today. Of course, the understanding and the explanation would then vary according to the political positionality, but mostly it was understood that actually this pioneer value framework is a universal framework. And indeed, it could be when we look at fair, honest, courageous, progressive, tenacious, hardworking. Those are indeed the elements that we could easily imagine forming a part of curricula of civic education classes today, for example, implemented by Council of Europe. So in general, this memory of childhood is easy, careless, and everything is really going good. And then there is the concept of normal life that appears. And as I know, even as Popović in her work, when she was mentioning Yugonostalgia, she would say, well, you know, this is just a question of normal life. There is nothing political in it. I, on the other hand, believe that actually the concept of a normal life is a very political term. What we understand as normal, what we understand as elements of a normal life is highly ideologically defined. It was also interesting, for example, when I've put this quote, when people worked and lived in my thesis, my French mentor said, yeah, but this is ridiculous. This doesn't mean anything because people everywhere work and live. But that is exactly what shows us the relationship, because it is the sentiment from today's point of view that it was exceptional to have a normal life of working and living. And that's how the present is once again coloring our memory narrative. More importantly, in a large number of cases, people would say that in their childhoods, now when they reminisce, the atmosphere, the value framework, what they've grown up was this possibility of a hope, possibility of a future on one side, and on the other side, a future that was not actually then delivered to them. They woke up to a life that was very much different from the one that they have been promised to. Then we discussed, you know, what are their associations, and these are the value frameworks that have came out through coding from the memory narratives of the last pioneers. Of course, there is a number of tropes that appears often, like sleeping on the bench in a park, that we all know and have heard so many times, but this indeed remains in memory narratives as a sentiment of safety, as a sentiment of freedom in the same time. And then, of course, most importantly, there is a number of significant, important, even easily understood as political values today, or what some would call more public policy values. So the questions of social care, right to housing, right to healthcare, right to education, women's emancipation, anti-nationalist and anti-fascist values. Solidarity has been an absolutely unified, unanimous value that appeared in all of the narratives, that it was a society of solidarity, which they do not perceive anymore existing. And it was really interesting to see that the word solidarity was appearing across the whole of the political spectrum in memory narratives of the last pioneers. Also, another important maybe point to say, because I have often encountered comments that with the crisis, the economic crisis of the 80s in Yugoslavia, already these influences that were anti-Yugoslav started to emerge, especially within the working class families. Actually, the results of my research show quite the opposite, that it was more within the higher middle class families that we would encounter anti-Yugoslav sentiments. And then, of course, comes the rupture. And once again, I had one word that was used throughout all three countries, all political spectrum, and that was overnight. All of the last pioneers have a sentiment that everything happened overnight, that basically they have just woke up, and in the time of their adolescence, things have completely changed, and something absolutely incomprehensible for them has arrived. And it is, of course, marked by people leaving, by their friends leaving, by first encountering ethno-national identity, mostly in schools, different discriminative comments, or themselves becoming refugees. There was a new normality of violence, but this was mostly related to the periods usually after the war, as many who have really lived through the war said, well, in the war itself, you try to survive, but then the atmosphere that has changed is actually visible only once the war ends. Regarding the code and the term of 1990s, it was interesting to see that there, for example, we could see the difference between the three countries. In Slovenia, 1990s, they're mostly referred to the Yugoslav wars in the rest of the countries, but they do not carry a specific significance on its own. In Croatia, it is the year of the wars. And in Serbia, it's the overall collapse, the economic crisis, the sanctions. So here, of course, the contextualized differences between the three countries differs. On the other side, everything else where I do not underline means that there has been more convergences between the three countries. And this has also been very important for me in my research to avoid any sort of methodological nationalism, so to try to really to understand as a common space while taking, of course, into account the different contexts. It was interesting to see that actually a lot of it was indeed shared. What was also shared among all of the interviewees, that whenever there would be a depiction of a war trauma, no matter how grave it was, there would be always an addition, but you know, it was not that bad. It was okay. We got out of it okay. And then there was another element that would appear, which would be this kind of what I call solidarity of pain, making reference to other post-Yugoslav spaces that have suffered more. So there would be always a need to show that whatever they have gone through, there has been somebody in the post-Yugoslav space that has actually suffered more than themselves. And already in this period of the wars, of the dissolution of the country, of course, dependent upon their age, but some resistance strategies start appearing among the last pioneers. They remain at an individual level, or like we have here, the case of a member of parliament who would be buying Hrvatska Ljevica by Stipe Šuvar as the only two people in Zadar who would be buying them. And he had this kind of routine where then he would walk around Zadar with Ljevica under his, because he wanted to make a statement even at already such a young age. Of course, when discussing this overnight rupture of the dissolution and the wars, through the memory narratives, we have discussed the last pioneers' understanding of the dissolution, understanding of the wars. And here in the narratives was the most important moment where they would start more and more understanding the public mainstream discourses, confusions, these ambivalences. And this is also important for the research itself, that yes, I do understand the public mainstream discourse to be revisionist, but it's also important to note that it is ambiguous and it is not unified, and it is sometimes very much differing from individual to individual case. And it has sent itself a lot of cognitive dissonances into the public field. So in the situation where the last pioneers kind of face the mainstream revisionist anti-Yugoslav discourses, and they kind of reflect about their own childhoods, about their own memory narratives about Yugoslavia, they enter the space of cognitive dissonance. And I do believe that for a very long time, this is exactly what Yugonostalgia in a more cultural, in a more banal way was providing to people, is this place where they can actually put their cognitive dissonances into. And what happens within the narratives, the interviews themselves, when we start discussing this ambiguity, this ambivalence, is that either there would be, for the first time, reflection or understanding, yes, actually, this is the problem, because whenever we want to say anything good or bad about Yugoslavia, or neutral, we actually face this situation that it is named Yugonostalgia, and even just the mere reflection is already mainly badly named, and even we ourselves denied to be Yugonostalgic. Nobody wanted to actually declare themselves as Yugonostalgic. There was a strong need to say, I am not Yugonostalgic. And this would also change in the course of the interviews themselves. Second strategy that was used was this particularity and exceptionality. Especially, and this was dependent upon the political positionality of the interviewees. So discussing the childhood, discussing the growing up, there were no memories of repression, there were no memories of hard life experiences due to the socialist regime in Yugoslavia, etc., etc. And then the discussion of the dissolution of the wars would make them come back. And then they would say, well, you know, yeah, I didn't go through anything bad, but I'm sure that I was just lucky, that it was just like this exceptional case. So there is a need, according to our political positionality, to re-narrate our memory narrative today. As I have already mentioned, the reflection on the present is exclusively negative, regardless whether they belong to the countries that have gone through the accession process to the European Union or not. And this is where anti-capitalist element starts appearing among the left wing as much as among the right wing political actors. And discussing about what they feel when they think about Yugoslavia today, it is home. Home is most often connected as the Adriatic Sea. And this is also interesting to see that it has really remained a trope, which as once in the Yugoslav times was bringing in different senses everybody together. It is also what is happening today as well. What is important to note, of course, the sentiment of home is also connected to linguistic proximity. Kosovo does not appear in the narratives. Kosovo is usually literally forgotten from the fact that it was part of Yugoslavia. Whenever there are memory narratives about their childhood, their growing up, so when we stay in this personal, intimate development of our Yugoslav identity, Kosovo really does not appear. It's also the now country that has been least visited among the last pioneers. And yes, in the right-wing Serbian narratives, it then appears as a present problem. But it was interesting to see that in a way, it does not make the idea of Yugoslavia. Slovenia is also somehow sometimes understood as a little bit different, but still does remain as this unique post-Yugoslav space. Economic and cultural space is something that really we have all discussed so many times. Nobody's even putting it under a question anymore, regardless of the political positionality. What appears often when trying to describe this common cultural space, this common post-Yugoslav space, were two elements on one side. One is that there is always this narrative about that the others have it better. So yeah, in Slovenia, it is horrible, but you know, actually the Serbs, they're so much better than us. They protest, they fight. There is no hope for Slovenia, but there are so many things happening in Serbia. And actually everybody would just change this depending on which country they come to. So it's always the worst in their own country today and better in all the rest of the post-Yugoslav countries, regardless of the reality of the situation. And what I have named as anti-communism, and I believe that this is also one of the places where the memory narratives very much appropriate the mainstream discourses. This is this discussion about the socialist mentality, that they're still, especially among the center and the right-wing interviewees, of course, it's the socialist mentality that kind of prevents us to further develop. And then what happens is that it starts intersecting largely this question of Yugonostalgia and Yugoslavism, and those become two terms that kind of develop in parallel in a way. And Yugoslavism then starts being understood in so many different manners. But what is the most important thing is that Yugoslavism is almost uniquely accepted. There is a difference which appears, and I will talk about it later on, in Croatia, but the right-wing interviewees in Slovenia and in Serbia very often were pro-Yugoslav in different ways, whether making a reference that actually in itself it was not a bad idea, saying that actually it would not be a bad idea. One Slovenian interviewee literally said that, well, you know, the only reason there is no new Yugoslavia is because the Croats are between Slovenes and Serbs. So there is this interesting ideological division that starts appearing actually among. And of course, you know, there is a number of resistance strategies that they have all expressed among the anti-nationalist activists, which are left-wing and center activists who understand Yugoslavism more as this expression of anti-nationalism, of their own kind of statement against these national hegemonic discourses that have appeared with the dissolution and the wars. What is also interesting to see as another element that starts appearing is that Yugoslavism becomes also an expression against Orientalism and Balkanism. And that is, of course, coming from the mainstream so-called Western discourses, the way that the Balkans have been depicted since the dissolution of Yugoslavia and the Yugoslav wars. Yugoslavism and this expression of Yugoslav identity is in a way demanding a recognition of some dignity in the political subjectivities. So a large number, especially given the sample of the interviewees, have become activists primarily through their anti-nationalist activism. And this is the key notion that kind of brought to them closer into these reflections about Yugoslavism, etc. As I have also mentioned, anti-capitalism then brings the so-called right-wing activists also to the table. And we enter this situation where anti-nationalism and anti-capitalism are not appearing in the same narratives. And also anti-Yugoslavism does not necessarily mean anti-communism. And this is here the main the division and difference that I have made between Yugoslavism and Yugonostalgia is that in my perception, Yugoslavism can actually contain elements of anti-communism, while Yugonostalgia is usually pro and from the left-wing positionality. So it is not anti-communist because nobody has referred to the first Yugoslavia or expressed any kind of nostalgia for the first monarchist republic. So there was also this very clear understanding when we talk about Yugonostalgia, we talk about the socialist Yugoslav times. So in the understanding of the last pioneers, it meant that, yes, there is this ideological discursive strategy that is embedded in the term of Yugonostalgia itself. And then, of course, here among this community, I also don't have to remind you that the first use of the term Yugonostalgia was actually coming in the 90s in Croatia with a famous case when there was this horrible article published about Croatian feminists raping Croatia. This is the first recorded in most of the researchers' use of Yugonostalgia in the public space as a politically sensitive term. So what then the last pioneers say? Yes, I think it was so much better. I think that there was a value framework that existed, which I respect today. I think that there was a number of issues with the country which have been working out and which we should reflect about working out today. But I am not Yugonostalgic. And this is where it comes to the realization we're saying, well, actually, you know, there is this problem with the term of Yugonostalgia because it's denying any kind of reflection of a different present, actually. And then they, of course, give a number of examples also for why Yugoslavism is somehow for them, as they perceive, an expected and natural political development for the post-Yugoslav space. Then, of course, and this has been since the end and during the field work, but there have been a lot of developments, as I have mentioned, new movements turning into political parties, this declaration of on regional solidarity that has been published, trade unions that have been cooperating. So in general, it was also very interesting to see that what has in a way been shown in the memory narratives of the last pioneers I have interviewed really starting appearing on the surface in the political fields of the post-Yugoslav space since the end of the fieldwork to this very, very day. And then, of course, this idea of the old solidarities is also in the memory narratives very often connected to the fact of common anti-colonial, anti-fascist struggles. I can go because I want to leave us more time for discussion, but as you know, this has been a caricature that has caused a lot of discussions across the region, and it was interesting to see because I'm not sure if it would have been possible for this to appear 10 years ago. So there is a movement, I believe, that also in a way these memory narratives are starting to be more prominent in the political field and starting to actually gain more space. Interestingly enough, I also did check Kapetanović is born in 76. So he does belong to what would be called the generation of the last pioneers. As it has already been enumerated, there are a number of different resistance strategies, from the most personal ones, which I still consider very political, like this question that, and this was especially evoked by mothers, women who were saying that they are trying to transmit the pioneer values to their children. To the more ideological cooperations, which happen also between the right wing as much as the left wing. An interviewee from Dveri in Serbia was depicting the famous situation when they have invited Pernar to the parliament and how appalled he was that this old right-wing people were actually shouting at the Dveri that they are Ustaše just because they have invited a Croatian colleague. So it's important to say that, yes, of course, the left wing has a prominence, but this is changing. Another important thing for me that was interesting to note was that actually a number of political parties and movements did start, at least in social media, a bit more using the Yugoslav tropes, the references to Yugoslav history in the last couple of years. And all of this, in a way, and all these generational shifts, I do believe, are strongly influencing the political field, and they're changing the overall context, like the case in Slovenia, where, of course, they say that even the appearance of Levica has already changed the understanding that it might be a legitimate position to be left-wing and socialist today. So through these memory narratives, and especially the way they dialogue with the mainstream discourses and with the generational and political positionality of the political actors, we can see that the memory narratives are also transforming in various ways and at different levels into more consequent political actions and causes. And what has in the end kind of really encompassed the reflections of my interviewees, because there is Yugoslav identity which does not demand a new Yugoslav state, it wants to adhere and embrace the idea of a nation, but it still demands a recognition of a unique space and a unique identity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Milica. To me, I have written some points that I would like, but maybe it's better to give the floor to the others for any comments, questions on the Milica's presentation, and then afterwards I can jump in with my personal questions. So, guys, please. Okay, maybe should I break the ice? So again, thank you very much. This was some things were really new to me, and it was some concepts that you came up with were really thought-provoking, like the concept of normal life. To me, we usually read about concepts such as good life, which are closer to this social democratic tradition. Third way also was, surfing on that concept. But the concept of normal life is something that can really be developed further, especially in the context of the present moment. And what do people consider normal today, and how do they remember? They really do remember some normal times in both terms of social normality, political normality, economic normality, safety, in a way. So I'm curious to hear maybe some more empirical insights about what do people consider to be normal life. This is my first question. My second question goes in the direction of something you mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, when you were talking about the different perceptions of Yugoslavia on this line of division, along this line of division, right and left. And you said that Slovenes and Slovenian and Serbian right wing even tend not to be so critical towards Yugoslavia, unlike the Croatian right wing, which is by definition, and I would say both anti-Yugoslav and anti-communist. And I think these two narratives, especially in Croatia, coming from the right, indeed overlap. So I'm curious to hear more about why do you think this is so? In my view, I'm really not familiar with Slovenia. Maybe the insights from Slovenia would be valuable. But in Serbia, in my view, there is something I would define as Kusturica style, right-wing, anti-alter globalization, something close to Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro, but very far from what they call political Sarajevo or political Zagreb. And this is indeed a Serbian. I defined it in my thesis as the Serbian paradox, and it really owes pretty much to Milosevic and the degradation and complete ideological confusion in the 1990s that was not present in other former Yugoslav republics, at least not to an extent as in Serbia. And I had another question. Yes, I would like, and this is actually connected to this first question about what are your insights, what the interviewee said, what is normal life for them. I'm wondering if you can even make central this division between hopeful and hopeless times. Whether in the hopeless times the hope comes from the past, actually. When talking about Yugonostalgia in the present moment. So this is it for now. Thank you very much.
Do you want to have other question? And then I can answer to
it. Yeah, maybe yes. We have some questions in the chat. Janja Kumljenović, to everyone, I have a question. Janja, can you please?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Milica and Philip. Very nice to see you. And thank you for the excellent presentation. I was really looking forward to hearing about your research and potentially reading your thesis. So my question is around methodology and then also how this research is used, because it was really interesting at the beginning when you said about the nostalgic research in Europe, and how they mostly find, that this kind of less educated right wing, the typical tropes of population. So I wonder, if one would do a different kind of study in ex-Yugoslav countries, like population studies, you might probably get very similar results. However, your methodological design was very different. and focusing on very concrete generation and qualitative, etc. So I wonder, just how these different studies and research then can be used politically. So, because then you also say, okay, that this generation is so easily dismissed because it's called Yugonostalgic and so on. Just how does it, basically, I guess I'm kind of trying to bring together the role of research and the kind of research we do in the political discourse and how this is then used. And how do you then respond, or how do you see the other studies done in research that then, have these typical findings that the population that's nostalgic is, I don't know, less educated, less, rich, etc., etc. So, how do you see your research in parallel to that, and what work does different types of research do?
Thank you, Janja. Francesca has a question.
Okay, hi Milica, it's very nice to have you here, and your presentation was really fascinating. When you mentioned it, Slovenia and Croatia, what came up to my mind is that in border areas in both countries, mainly on the mainstream level, there is a slightly different narrative, a more positive and unproblematic narrative on Yugoslav socialism than, for example, in the centers in Ljubljana or in Zagreb. But I would say that there is also a tendency to reframe the Yugoslav legacy in nationalist terms. And this is especially visible not that much at the bottom-up level, but in the top-down public discourse. I mean, Yugoslavia and socialism are often regarded as deserving because they brought back the Slovenian littoral, Istria and Rijeka to the motherland, so using a clearly nationalist vocabulary and moving the focus away from social accomplishments or the ideological and political aspects of Yugoslav socialism. So I was wondering whether you had interviews with informants from the border areas in Slovenia and Croatia, and in that case, whether you found any kind of different narrative.
Thank you, Francesca. I suggest, Milica, you intervene now, and after that, Cody has a question in the second round.
Okay. Super. Thanks for nice words and excellent questions. And as always, it's really difficult to put everything in the presentation. So I hope this will clear up some of the issues. I'm going to go to Janja's question first, and because it's a methodological one. And yes, absolutely. I also believe that there was a huge importance in the methodological construction of my research. As Philip has mentioned in a way in his question about this problematic of understanding Yugonostalgia and Yugoslavism in this Serbian case. This is the biggest problem. Yugonostalgia is really just this empty signifier that everybody kind of puts in a lot of different meanings. If we stick to the surveys, if we stick to these very quantitative approaches, I am always a little bit cautious about, first of all, the formulation of the question, and second of all, what does it really tells us? For example, one of the big surveys that have been done that in media have been presented as this par excellence kind of proof of Yugonostalgia was the question that asked, do you regret the dissolution of Yugoslavia? And then it was said, oh, in Serbia, it's 80% of the people. I don't think it tells us anything about Yugonostalgia. It can tell us more even because a lot of those people regret the dissolution due to nationalist reasons, due to various different reasons. So this is, I think, when we're discussing the memory narratives and the way they truly influence our identities and especially political identities, it is really important to go more into these qualitative, in-depth really interviews. And researching narratives in a way that I have approached it through these long presence in the field and then also long interviews gave me an opportunity to see more nuanced, more ambiguous statements. These people are political actors. On the level of these very straightforward value terms, they would have given me completely different answers from what has come out from these hours of discussion of the interview that we have led. To be honest, I was personally surprised in so many cases. One example is, for example, really the most vocal far right-wing political actor in Croatia was so excited about the interview, who asked me to send him the tape because it was so wonderful to remember all of this. And then he said that it was such a pleasant experience, which he didn't expect. And then because we met in Zagreb, oh, well, I hope that maybe you're going to get married here in Croatia. And then I told him, like, yeah, and then you're going to be my godfather. And there was also, I think, a very important insight that fed into the research that came from this personal contact, which is something that we cannot always capture in the interviews, which is also why I wanted to use this life memory narrative stories, because I knew that up front, I'm not going to get the answer. I'm going to get the political paroles of their political parties, and that's it. But going through their life narratives, their life stories, we could really kind of go sometimes back and see all these ambivalences that would appear in their political positionality and in their reflections. That is why reflexivity has made a huge part of this research, both my own personal, which was really important to take note of, but then also of the interviewees themselves. Regarding Francesca's question of these regional, yes, of course. And I think this was also important in the construction, where I wanted to avoid methodological and nationalism. And this is an important insight. The regional differences are bigger than the in-country differences. So on the more general level, for example, when you look at the differences between Slovenia and Croatia, I would say the bigger differences are exactly from Primorska and then Ljubljana or Maribor, etc. And the same in Croatia, Istria, Dalmatia, or Zagorje. We have different reflections. And it is absolutely true that the littoral is more pro-Yugoslav because there is this strong heritage that is still remembered. And especially discussing the memory narratives, I didn't want to go more into, but yes, there is the concept of post-memory. So all these memories that are transmitted to us through the generation of our grandparents, through the generations of our parents, through communicative memory. So it is the memory narrative we build is always built also on the heritage of the previous generations, which then in these cases that you, Francesca, have mentioned, indeed plays a huge role. I mean, one of the interviewees in Slovenia remembers from his childhood, and he comes from Primorska region, and he started learning Italian. And he was very proud. Then he came to his grandfather to say, oh, granddad, I started learning Italian. And his grandfather was so upset with him. And he told him, I cannot believe that you are actually betraying everything that we fought for in our times. We had to fight to speak Slovenian while we were actually made to speak Italian, and now you are betraying all this. And he stopped learning Italian. He was so traumatized by why his granddad was so upset with him. So there is, of course, the history, the way of the specific regions that plays a lot. The reframe of some of the Yugoslav values in nationalism, yes, this is the revisionist mainstream discourse, and this is the contextualized actually situation in all of the countries. Like, for example, anti-fascism, when it does appear, it can appear in nationalized terms as well as the mainstream discourse. and then in Yugoslav terms, which is once again why I believe qualitative research is much more needed in order to really understand from which approach does actually the political subject perceives a specific term and the understanding of this term. And this is why, for example, for the right-wing interviewees, it is more common to adhere to this so-called cultural Yugonostalgia. So they kind of keep this personal cognitive dissonance between now this new built narrative and their own memories more in the spheres then of music, of movies. So they run into this cultural kind of, so I had a HDZ, a member of parliament, who told me, oh, you know, I went to the first Balašević concert as soon as he came to Croatia, but I don't tell that to anyone. I'm keeping it as a secret. So there is also a lot of secrecy happening. And this was an interesting to know, like in Croatia, even if we would have an interview in a public space, I didn't notice, which at first I thought was an anomaly, but actually then it confirmed it would happen everywhere. The moment we would start talking about Yugoslavia, those political actors would have a tendency to lower their voice, which did not happen in Slovenia or in Serbia, of course. So the way that they understand their memory narratives is definitely in connection to this mainstream narrative. And then going to Philip's question, the way I see it is connected, then of course this nationalization and national reappropriation of the Yugoslav values like anti-fascism also. I think this is also where we see appearing this Yugoslavism of the right wing or center-wing political actors in Slovenia or in Serbia, because in Serbia, the right-wing actors, yes, they will go, even if they don't always go into this nationalist idea that, you know, we had to save Yugoslavia, et cetera, but something that appears almost exclusively in right-wing interviewees, and it does appear also in the Croatian ones. It is, besides everything, yeah, okay, but we were respected. We were a big country. We were a big political and economic power. We were a big military power. And it was also interesting to see when discussing values, how really there are different terms depending on political positionality that appear. Because if an interviewee is more politically left-wing inclined, then we would have the women's rights, etc. The right wing, they would say discipline, there was order in the country, there was security, there was functioning state, but they still do refer that it was indeed better than today. So they were just kind of picking different elements of the Yugoslav state that they believe should be reinstated today in their ethno-national states. Normal life, I am so looking forward to actually further develop this. I absolutely agree with you that it is a very important question, especially because for me, the most interesting is this ideological fullness of these terms that we still tend to present as non-ideological. And then, yeah, good life is something that appears more. But in the narratives, it was really this normal life, the concept of normality, and which in itself has really embedded this Yugoslav, Yugonostalgic memory narrative of the last 5 years. And it was as basic as when people worked and lived. It was as basic as broken dreams where they would say, well, you know, my father was always telling me that I should just be a good student, and then when I finish my studies, I'm going to travel the world like he did. It is a concept of a Slovenian interviewee explaining how his mother finished high school and then she applied for a job and she got the first job and then she moved and then she got the apartment and she got a car and then she became an independent woman in such a simple way that none of the people in our generation can actually imagine. So this kind of simplicity of life and this kind of fairness, and what is also, for example, maybe something that might be interesting, there is this meritocracy that is kind of evoked, which is more often considered today in the public discourses that meritocracy is actually what happens in capitalism. But here it's really more related to the Yugoslav memories, because it kind of, there is a feeling that as much as you invested in your own education and you had access to education, you could actually then achieve this stability, this kind of less stressful understanding of what it means to have an employment, to have regular income. And it is also important to know that it was always said, we had enough. Yeah, maybe it wasn't, you know, the Disneyland in terms that we maybe shared the same toys, et cetera, but we don't need more. So there was a very strong anti-consumerist, anti-materialist element among all of the political actors from all three countries, from the whole of political spectrum. And this was also very interesting to see. The most negative references, to be honest, the most anti-Yugoslav, especially the most anti-communist references, the most violent, were actually coming from the center liberal political actors. The right-wing actors would say, well, you know, this is not my ideology. I have a lot against it. I think we suffered a lot, but I respect it because I respect the state. And like I said, there is this respect of the functionality of the state, et cetera, et cetera. The center liberal political actors were most violent in their anti-Yugoslav positions. I mean, even the only really unpleasant interview was with a center liberal self-identified, of course, political actor who said that anti-fascism is just made up. It's a stupid thing, and what we experienced was just Soviet occupation in 45, and then luckily in 1990 we managed to take them off. I don't know which Soviets, but yeah. So yeah, this was also something interesting to see, and it's more elaborated in my thesis. Then there is also a difference between the center and right wing in a lot of elements.
Okay, thank you. I see some more comments. Before, I would just like to misuse my role of moderator and just add that I can easily imagine that the greatest Yugonostalgists are the so-called sovereignists. Now, the people who claim or who are trying to reclaim sovereignty, if they are really rational, I think they are fully aware that reclaiming sovereignty actually means enlarging your international capacity, meaning enlarging the strength of your country. In realist terms, this is the enlargement of the territory, right? But I can easily imagine that they come to the point when they realize, okay, it's not, the greater Serbia is not possible now. Simply, you know, it's not possible. And then the appropriate replacement for that could be Yugoslavia or mini Yugoslavia. So I'm really not surprised that some, as you said, central right, you know, conservatives or are talking about Yugoslavia in terms of that great country respect. This is what we were getting from the international.
And this is where we come to also what was Janja's comment about Slovenia, because on one side there is the recognition that, okay, Slovenia came to existence through Yugoslav times, but on the other side is also this strong sentiment that they are not respected or taken into account seriously anymore anywhere, which was much different in Yugoslav times. So I absolutely agree with what you just said.
Okay, we have some more. Cody says I have a quick set of short questions, okay, for the next round. So Cody, please, and after him, Tanya. She would like to discuss a bit on normal life. Again, we can make the conversation more dynamic by going back and forth with the topics. That's good. Cody, please.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks, Milica. I have, well, Francesca took my regionality question, so I'll skip that one. But the other one that I had was like, if you were to imagine extending the project to all the former republics of socialist Yugoslavia, including all the different sort of minorities and confessional types, let's say, confessional categories, I wonder what your expectations would be, what your preconceptions would be about the sort of phenomenon of Yugonostalgia among different communities. My own little anecdote is that I met a guy from Subotica, Hungarian minority Jew, who's a professor of architecture in Budapest. I was editing a book for him, and he told me exactly along the sovereigntist line. He's like, man, it was so silly. The Serbs gave it all up. They had Greater Serbia, and they gave up the entire project in the 90s. Like, what idiots, you know? But he was like, it was sort of a way, his own coded way to sort of talk about Yugonostalgia by sort of making fun of the situation. And he was even sort of nostalgic in his own interesting way. But anyway, so I was just sort of, because he was coming from this minority background, Hungarian Jewish minority, then he had a very sort of different optics, it seems, from what you were registering in your interviews. And the sort of second last question that I have is about sort of using social media. For example, there are all these Facebook groups of former veterans from Yugoslav People's Army who sort of get together on these Facebook groups, and they try to look out for like their old buddies from like the different military bases, and they meet up and they have post pictures of like, you know, the three of them having beers in Sarajevo, and each one of them is from a different part and so on. And it seems to be a sort of a different manifestation of what you're talking about. I wonder if you've encountered this. Thanks.
Thanks, Cody. Maybe we can collect also Tanya's comments or questions. Tanya?
I would almost add this so we could, if that's okay with you, not to take over your moderation role, but just to sort of answer Cody's first and then go into a thing, or do you want to keep doing collections of, mine is more of a comment.
Sorry, I didn't hear the first because it was I couldn't hear you well.
Oh, I would suggest that you, Tanya, go because there is also Chiara's comment, and then we can make the final round.
Yeah. So I just wanted to sort of talk about this concept of normality in terms of in that it's an interest of Filip's and Milica's and mine. Just that it's sort of been found pretty regularly among people, anthropologists studying the post-socialist Balkans. So you have Steph Janssen in Sarajevo having this desire for normality, Jessica Greenberg in Serbia also doing the same thing. So this concept of normality and abnormality as a diagnostic category for the present. But just as a sort of point of interest is that, so I also did a research on people who were intending to emigrate, and they were younger than your interlocutors. So some were about that age, and so Yugoslavia in the past was a reference to their normal life. But I think among younger people, we might be losing that past reference, but the political category of normal is still there. So it's not like there is this time, but the normal persists. And so it's a question of whether one day we'll lose when that point of reference was, or if your sort of political Yugo-nostalgics are going to return it. And just finally, in terms of this nostalgia as a conservative act in more of a global sphere, I think we're also seeing a nostalgia in the US, for example, for Keynesianism, and sort of like people talking about like, oh, you know, we need to not forget that we used to be able to work one more working class job and raise an entire family even in 1990 or 1980s. And that the neoliberal project is to forget this sort of stuff. So even that may be changing now as nostalgia becomes a point of time to different normals. So that's kind of it.
Thanks, Tanya. Chiara, would you like to pose your question yourself, or you want me to read your question?
I can read as well, so it's okay.
Oh, okay, I was just wondering if Chiara wants to say it out loud, just to...
Yeah. No. I'm just. I think everybody can see, but Chiara's question. So let me just go to Cody first. Social media, yeah, of course, social media is really very rich with numbers of different expressions. But that is also the problem that Especially you mentioned this Yena, for example, people who are trying to meet. And I think that it was part of this discursive creation of the Yugonostalgic term to say, well, you know, these are just these private, intimate things that happen on Facebook, things that happen in parties, things that happen maybe a little bit in museums or in homes, but they are not politically relevant. So this is really something that I was kind of trying to make this bridge of showing that, you know, personal is political, and then of course that all these intimate spaces do have their ways of entering the political field. Regarding the minorities, I did have, now it's a little bit shameful to say one Hungarian from Serbia, because it seems like this one good, but I was kind of trying to have more really minorities included. And there were, of course, Serbian representatives in Croatia. There were the South Yugoslavs in Slovenia. So there was regarding the identity, and I didn't have a time to expand more on it. But the last pioneers grew up in what they call also Yugoslav family. And for them, Yugoslav family is not only the mixed marriage in terms of ethno-nationality, it also meant mixed religious denominations, mixed political positionalities. So there is a sense that actually what existed in the times of Yugoslavia was a much more diverse society than what they're witnessing today. And from there, for a lot of minorities in different countries, there is a sentiment that actually their lives and their minority positions would be much better, were much better in Yugoslavia than are today in the nation states. Then, of course, expanding the research further, I think there would be so many different and interesting expectations to see. But I wouldn't dare to kind of give a very precise depiction. What I do expect would be most difficult is, of course, Kosovo, first of all, because of my own problem that I don't speak Albanian. So I think that this would also influence my methodology and the possibility to establish trust with the interviewees. And because it is the political climate that is maybe just still developing into possibilities of opening certain spaces for specific reflections. And then because it really, in my belief, is more a colonial situation, which is very, very different from the rest of the Yugoslav space. So this would definitely change the perspective. Regarding Tanya, yeah, the anthropologist and the normal life has been noted. I didn't still have the time to read the new Jensen, but it would be interesting. What was interesting with Jensen is that in his anti-nationalism, in the chapter where he referred to Yugonostalgia, and we know Jensen was doing his research among a different group of these NGO activists, or what he sometimes even calls anti-war profiteers. But Jensen claims that it is a cultural and an individual phenomenon of Yugonostalgia. The way I see it, I believe that this is something what happens because his research was done in the early 2000s. And I think a lot of the things that have appeared in my research have also appeared because of the time, the specific time moment in which I was conducting my research. That's why I say that this longitudinal kind of perspective would really enrich the whole reflection. Yes, the problem with nostalgia is, I think that's why it was so important for me to kind of bring this link, because nostalgia is actually, and not only in post-socialist countries, like I have mentioned in the beginning, it's just a discursive strategy to to kind of reinforce this idea that we live in a world with no ideologies anymore. And this is why the memory studies are becoming so prominent. This is why the memory narratives are becoming so prominent, because we're trying to claim that we don't have ideologies anymore. There are just these centrists and populists are now encompassing all different ideologies. So instead of saying we are witnessing a rise of left-wing politics in the United States, we say, well, you know, this is nostalgia for Keynesianism. Or instead of saying, well, you know, there is a very serious problem in the political field in the UK, we say, well, Brexit is just nostalgia for the imperial strength of the UK. So I think it really is this easy way to dismiss a lot of emerging phenomena which do not fit this idea of mono-ideological world in which we live in. And then I have Chiara. Yes, of course, and I have tried to put it forward in my thesis. Life in Yugoslavia was associated with women's emancipation in comparison today. There is a strong sentiment of loss, which, of course, unfortunately, male interviewees very rarely make a link to women's emancipation. It was the female interviewees that would raise this question. And it was interesting to see when discussing especially childhood that I have came across a lot of narratives because these are the female political actors that were saying that they have become strong political activists because they had these strong Yugoslav women in their families, because their aunts, their mothers, their grandmothers have set an example of a possibility to participate in the public and political life. So this kind of also comprehension of this idea of a Yugoslav socialist woman has often been raised as one of the empowerment elements in the political activism of female political actors today. The major differences, which I also tried to note, and I maybe have mentioned it before, is, for example, when discussing the Yugoslav values, the transmission to their children of the values was always mentioned and only by female interviewees. I did not have one single male interviewee that was discussing his own children and how he tries to transmit their value frameworks. So there have been really some elements that are interesting, and I tried to incorporate as much as possible this also gender analysis in the thesis. And we have how translational.
Yeah, I think we have just a couple of minutes more, maybe 2 or 3 minutes more. And I can see that there are some more questions, and hopefully you can maybe if we met live, maybe we could have done it over the coffee break, but maybe just a minute or two if you have some general concluding remarks. Yeah. Well, okay, please.
Yeah, I do hope that we will meet, and especially hopefully on stress. But I'm sorry for Emina. I think if I understand her question well, is how does transgenerational transmission of memory influences today? And yeah, of course, I think it is indeed one of the conclusions is how much of the political socialization is taking place in our families, but that is not necessarily new. Like that, we don't have a single case of a right-wing activist coming from left-wing families, but we do have a lot of cases of left-wing political actors coming from right-wing families. So I think that there are some things that have, in a way, been expected. What was interesting, which I think might be different in different countries, and I mean this at a global level, was the prominence of grandparents' memory narratives, and that this actually wider Yugoslav family played a role. So when we say this family socialization, it really indeed means aunts, uncles, nieces, relatives. So it kind of depicts also this cultural and socioeconomic reflection of what it meant to grow up in Yugoslavia, because it meant you're going to have your aunts taking care of you or take you to the seaside because they have their radničko odmaralište on Jadran, so they bring you along with their own kids. Your grandparents are often taking care of you, etc., etc. So there is this really much larger diversity in these influences. And I think that also what is important to note is that is a lot of, regardless of this transgenerational transmission, there are a lot of specificities about this generation. And I think it's an interesting generation, really, being born into Yugoslav times, going through very traumatic adolescence, and then being faced with something completely new. And I think this is really important also for understanding of how political generations develop in a way. Like, for example, one maybe interesting element. Very often so far in research on Yugonostalgia, it has been also said, oh, this is the image of Tito. This is this paternalistic need of the generations for Tito. Tito appeared almost never in my memory narratives. When he did appear, he would usually appear, well, you know, they had a problem with this personality cult in Yugoslavia. So even when saying actually negatives, but he does not actually play a prominent role in the memory narratives. Really, this kind of reflections on the Yugoslav past are truly embedded in a very ideological and political understanding of what has been lost and what needs to be rebuilt.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Milica. I think people enjoyed your presentation, and I hope you enjoyed the dialogue and the discussion we had after your presentation. We wish you successful defense in the couple of days, if I understood correctly. No, in a couple of days it will be over, but we wish you a successful defense in the coming months then, and hopefully we're gonna meet up and catch up somewhere on the coast soon next year.
Thank you, Philip. Thanks a lot. We very much look forward to have you with us, to have you all with us. All the best.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.